So as far as this talk goes tonight, I think I've been a member of this group for something like 2 years now. I moved from Reno and come out here to be the lead Scrum Master for study. Most of the times when we have these conversations, we have an expert who gets up in front of us and they talk about some wonderful wisdom that we try to bring back to our own organizations. Tonight, though, I want to do something a little bit different. I just want to tell you a story. And for me, the story started about 1.5 years ago, and it started simply with a question, which is, what metrics will my teams find useful? And before we really get into some of the answers to this question, before I tell you about some of that story, I want to tell you a little bit about my own story. It was my MBA professor, his name was Brett Simmons. He had taught me that before you can appreciate someone's perspectives, you first need to understand the lens through which they see the world. So let me tell you a little bit about me first. Again, I've been here at Study for about 2.5 years. I work as their senior Scrum Master. I work with not only with teams, but with Scrum Masters to help them with their own teams. I also write an Agile blog on the side at spikesandstories.com. I'm surprised that people read what I have to say. I started writing just for myself. I started sharing some of the ideas. I didn't know people would really be interested in it, and it turns out that many people have commented on it. I've had people like Jeff Sutherland and Mike Beadle come by and comment, and Mike Cohn has shared some of my work in the past. It's very flattering. I never expected it. I just wanted to share my thoughts with the world, and for me it was really therapeutic to share a lot of those thoughts. When I wrote, it taught me either how little I knew, which those are the things I throw away and don't post, or how much I know about various topics. So it's been fun. It's been enjoyable. It's even connected me with groups like this, where 2 years ago when I first joined, I sat quietly in a corner and didn't talk to anybody. And now I'm up here talking to all of you. And most of you I know, most of you I've met, and it's very comfortable to be up here. And I appreciate all the conversations we've had over the last 2 years. So I think the most interesting part about my story, though, was my time in the Marine Corps. I was an intelligence operative and a martial arts instructor for the Marine Corps for about a decade of my life. And I earned a computer science degree when I was in. I had resigned my commission, and then I found a job as a software engineer. Shortly thereafter, I had sort of fell into project management, and I started doing that. And there was a buddy of mine, a fellow project manager. His name was Brian, and he accused me one day of being agile. I had no idea what that meant. I had to look it up, and come to find out that what civilians call agility, the Marine Corps simply calls leading Marines. Are there any veterans other than me in the room? What service were you in? Oh, hoorah. So I'm curious. Well, we should connect afterwards, Kevin, and talk a little bit more about that. I didn't realize you were a Marine too. So I think really what drove this home for me was a book called Core Business, and this book was written by David Friedman. And what he had done is he interviewed a bunch of very influential Marines, and he had distilled those conversations down to what he called the 30 management principles of the Marine Corps. These are 3 of them right here. I think as you read them, you'll see a lot of agile mindset baked into some of these thoughts, and in the other 27, you'll see it as well. And this drove the point home for me that the thing that I had been doing while I was in the Marine Corps is the thing that I'm doing now as a project manager and later as an Agilist. And it's been enjoyable. It's been fun. I've been working with teams for a while now, and it's a great experience, and it's great to maybe use a little bit softer of an approach than I might have used in the Marine Corps, but it's the same kind of mindset and mentality that was taught to me by the Corps. So let's get back to our story. What metrics will my teams find useful? Before I share some of my own thoughts, I'm curious from all of you, what metrics have your teams found useful? Anybody? Okay, burn-up chart, that's a great one. Cycle time, you'll see more of that tonight. Anything else? Good ones.
And percentage of bugs within the last 30 days plus the percentage of bugs in our product backlog plus the number of bugs that they have created within the last 30 days.
So you're looking to measure quality or a proxy for quality in some way. Okay. You'll see us talk about quality soon. What about you, Dan? Okay, you'll see some use of velocity here. However, we should be looking at more than just velocity when we're looking at data. Any others? Daryl?
Number of test winners.
That's an interesting one. Yes. So, oh, go ahead.
Hopefully I won't get run out. Cost schedule product.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, how much money are you burning? How much schedule have you used on a fixed schedule contract? And how much work have you actually done?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I can tell you for me. Oh, Edwin. Okay, one more.
Team happiness.
I feel like you're cheating because you work here. So I can tell you for me that usually the first question that I ask somebody when they tell me they work in an Agile shop is the same one. Or whenever I see the question in LinkedIn groups that I contribute to of I've started my first Scrum team and I'm trying to figure out if they're headed in the right direction. What is it that I should be looking at? And usually it's always the same question I ask first, and it comes from the manifesto where it says that working software is the primary measure of progress. So the question is this, it's how many times are you delivering working code to your target environment? It's a really easy question to answer. We all should be able to know the answer to that question because of the teams we're working with. We should know how often they're delivering working code to their target environment. So for those who don't work at Study, do not raise your hand. For everybody else, if you work with a team that is delivering at least once every 3 months, put your hands up. At least once a month, keep your hand up. Once every 2 weeks. Once a week. Once a day. Multiple times a day. Put your hand down. You don't count. Good. I'm glad to have some folks from Atlassian here tonight because I'm actually going to be talking about Jira a little bit. So there's a few of you, Anthony and Dan and Kevin, all folks from Atlassian. In fact, if you don't know, Atlassian's a neighbor of ours. They're have the office adjacent to us next door. So we have this space and also the space next door. So it's great to have them next door. Great popcorn for Christmas. Absolutely love it. It's delicious. You have no idea how excited some of our folks were to get more of that popcorn. So, where was I? So I can tell you here at Study, we deliver to production on average of 6 times a day. And I think we have a high of about 13 in a single day. And I should also explain why this measure is so important and why delivering frequently is so important. So does anybody play any musical instruments? What do you play, Jim? Piano. All right. So how old were you when you learned to play the piano? How old? 4 or 5? Okay. So I want you to pretend that you're 4 or 5, and I'm going to describe, hopefully, I have no musical talent whatsoever, but I'm going to try to describe how you learn to play the piano. You'll correct me if I'm wrong. So you learned to play by hitting a key, and then you heard a sound, and you either heard the right sound or you heard the wrong sound. And then over time, as you continue to play, you continue to hit more of the right notes instead of the wrong notes. And it is certainly an oversimplification. So, Jim, I want you to pretend that I'm going to replace that piano that you learned from, where you got that instant feedback with this new instrument, this special piano called the delayed piano. And now how it's going to work is that once you press a key, it takes 15 seconds before you hear a sound. So you press a key, and you wait. And you wait, and you wait some more, and then 15 seconds go by and you hear a sound. And then you press another key, and you wait another 15 seconds. Wouldn't you agree that it's going to take you a lot longer to learn to play the piano with this delayed piano?
I can already tell you that if it's delayed half a second, it drives you.
So I think that is why I think delivering working software frequently is important, because every time you deliver that code is an opportunity to learn something new about your customers. And if you're not delivering frequently, you're robbing yourself of the opportunity to learn as much as possible. I think the analogy of this delayed piano or guitar or any other instrument drives that point home. And that's why I think frequent delivery of software is valuable and important. Now again, I'll remind you that we're delivering working code here at Study many, many, many times a day. So for us, this became a lot more interesting of a question, because no longer was the question of delivering working software to your target environment so relevant. I had to find other metrics that would help us. And at this time, there were a few things that had occurred at roughly the same period of time. One of them was, anybody familiar with Troy McGinnis? Wow, that's surprising. Great, smart guy. I had watched a video of his of metrics that he was using with teams, and I drew a great amount of inspiration from him. In fact, some of the earliest versions of what I'm going to show you tonight, I had sent his way, and we had discussed, and he offered up some ideas. I took a great deal of inspiration from Troy. I also, throughout my career, I borrowed heavily from Mike Cohn, who I think you'd all agree has a very emotional perspective on how to affect change within teams, which was in contrast to what I learned from Jeff when he came out to the Bay Area and I took a class with him. I noticed he had a very data-driven approach to helping teams. So I was trying to find a way to marry those two together. How can I take the emotional and bridge it to a data-driven kind of approach? And so I had those two notions in my head, and I also wanted to leverage. So at study.com, we use a lot of the things you find from the Lean Startup Playbook. So we A/B test everything. We also have 12 Scrum teams. 6 are technical, 6 are non-technical. We have all our technical teams are using XP. So almost everything you'd find from XP, our technical teams are doing. And then we have the Lean Startup. And I thought what was ironic was we had all this information about all the customers who come to our site every single day, but we had so little information about, at the time, the 70 people working for study.com. I thought it was ironic that we spent all this time knowing our customers so well, but spent so little time understanding the people around us and how the teams were connected and how the team members were connected to each other. So we have hackathons twice a year. We get together, we stop doing our usual work, we gather whatever teams that want to form around whatever ideas that people have, and we have 24 hours to create something, and then at the end of those 24 hours, we showcase that in this lunch area right here to everybody else in the company, and then they vote on who they thought had the best idea. And at the time, there was a hackathon, we call them rockathons. There was a rockathon that was about to occur, and so I had these ideas rolling around in my head. So I grabbed 2 engineers, and I convinced them to join my team. It was Mike and Salil, who aren't here tonight. Our data analyst, Ashley, who has been, again, with me from the beginning of this. Thank you so much for everything you've done. It has been so much appreciated. I truly, 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 truly appreciate it. So Ashley's been from the beginning. She's our data analyst, and she's been helping us with this. And so at the end of 24 hours, we put something together. And when we first met, when we first were talking about what we were going to do, I outlined some of the things that I took away from Troy and Mike and Jeff. For example, some ideas behind what makes for good metrics. Things like ensuring that what you're looking at has a story, that you're looking at this data as a team and you can understand why the data is telling you what it's telling you. We also wanted to look at things that were within the team's influence. We didn't want teams to look at data and then have no way to do anything about it. We wanted to look at things that influenced the future, that allowed us some potential insights into what the future held. So we wanted to look at leading indicators. We also wanted to look at trend-based data. We didn't want to look at a single data point. We wanted to look at data over time so that the team could compare itself today to the team it was yesterday to see what has changed and what looks better and what might look worse. We also talked about some attributes of bad data. For example, they're just convenient to capture. Velocity is a convenient one to capture, and it can be useful as long as it's used in conjunction with other data, I think. We also wanted to avoid trailing indicators that just tell us about the past. We wanted to avoid metrics that you could game, like, for example, you overemphasize velocity, and then you end up with inflation to story points, but no actual additional work being done. And then we wanted to avoid individual-based metrics. We were looking to measure teams, and we wanted to emphasize the team, so we weren't looking at individuals on the teams, we were looking at the teams as a whole. And some of the goals we had set out as a team is we wanted to inspire richer conversations. We wanted the data to inform conversations that were going to occur. We wanted to not only look at things based on what they felt, but based on also what the data said. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later, but we also wanted to create a framework for experimentation. We thought one of the things that I think has been most useful through this is many times when some of our leaders of the organization disagree with an idea that a team has for an experiment, they used to go, no, don't do that. Now it's more, I don't think it'll work. Try it. Let's see what the data says. And that's been really useful to use this kind of framework in order to emphasize that. We also wanted to measure things in multiple dimensions, and we wanted those dimensions to have attention. We wanted them to be inversely correlated. So what I mean is, for example, let's say we double velocity. At what cost? Did we have everybody working 60-hour weeks? Or did we just toss quality out the window and now we're sending crap out the door? So sure, there was a benefit. We got more done, but at what cost? So we wanted to have some tension in those metrics. Now, what we came up with, and forgive me if you can't read this, we're going to go through each one of these in just a moment. But what we came up with was this, and this was almost what was done in 24 hours. I say almost because we've iterated and we fixed a few things. In fact, these bottom two metrics are new. And so 80% of what you're seeing came out of the 24-hour hackathon that we had. We also want the teams to look at this data in the same way you're looking at it here, albeit a little bigger. And we want them to look at all the data points as a whole and not hone in on a single data point. We're looking as well at a single team. In fact, this is, where's Ed? This is the product owner for this team's data, and Ashley is the data analyst for that same team. So this is all real data from one of our teams, and we're looking at 24 weeks of data, 12 sprints, over the, and we're taking this from multiple sources. We're taking this data from Jira, we're taking it from HipChat, which is our real-time chat program, we're taking it from Git, and we're taking it from Namely, which is our HR system. So we're taking all that data and coalescing it into a single place so we can have a single view of what this looks like. And again, this is what the team is looking at. And you see, I blacked it out here, but you see the team members on the right-hand side so people know who they belong to. So let's talk about each one of these individually for a moment. This one is the top left one. This one is predictability. Now what you're looking at here is, again, over 12 sprints. Each one of these data points is a sprint. If you mouse over a data point, you see that it comes up with data relevant to that particular computation. This data comes exclusively from Jira. The way we're calculating this is we look at the end of the sprint, we look at the number of story points they completed, the team completed, and divide it by the number of story points that they had committed to, or forecasted, as some prefer, at sprint planning. So if you committed to 50 points and you completed 50 points, the number would be 100%. And what we have as well is you see the gray band across, and we're just telling teams, hey, you probably want to end up between 90 and 120% if you can. If you don't, that's okay, but we just want to give you a measure of where we think that you want to end up. Now, speaking of the story as well, you see the big dip right there, and then the big spike all the way up. There's a story here. I'm in fact the Scrum Master for this team, and what had happened is we had a bunch of disruptions that occurred during that sprint that we didn't anticipate. We had a dependency on another team, and we weren't quite finished with the work because of that dependency at the end. So we ended up not getting as much done that sprint. And then you see the next sprint where it happened to overcorrect because we're not giving partial credit for stories. So then they got done with all that stuff on the first or second day of the sprint, and now they're eager to pull in more work, so they tended, in that case, to undercommit. This is the next one. This is speed. This is very heavily driven from velocity, and you'll see that in a moment. This one is actually coming from two sources. We pull it from Jira, obviously, for velocity, but we also pull data from Namely, our HR system, which is telling us when people are taking vacation days. The reason we do that, now the formula is complicated, so I won't describe all of it, but it's essentially velocity divided by capacity. And capacity means it's a shorter, this is how many days are in the sprint, this is how many team members are on the team, this is how many days people took vacation days this sprint. So for example, the reason that's useful for us is you have sprints like this sprint, which is 2 weeks long, all 10 days people are here, and not a lot of PTO days. Compared to next sprint, which has 2 days for Christmas, a day for New Year's, and lots of vacation time. So what we wanted to do is have a comparison between that sprint, this sprint, and next. And having a computation where we're dividing velocity by capacity gives us that. Yeah?
How do you factor in overtime hours? I mean, that's only a factor there. You got
we don't log time here. We don't log time.
Huh?
We don't log our hours.
Right, so you could have worked 40 hours. Everyone on the team
Yeah.
40 hours on one sprint. On the following sprint, everyone's put in 80, 70 hours, whatever the numbers are.
Well, if we were doing that, we wouldn't be a very good Agile team. There is, I think, in my opinion, there's a place for overtime as long as it's only used sparingly. The Marine Corps taught me that well, that they would work our asses off some days, but then they made up for it in others. So I think overtime is great if used sparingly. And it's not something that we do a lot of around here. We put in the time if we need to and if we want to because we're passionate about it.
It's not a baseline assumption that thou shalt work.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
That's how you do it. You got to have ongoing sustainability.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. A few other things worth mentioning is you see this trend line going across. That's actually telling you that over the last 12 sprints, that their velocity has been, at least on average, relatively flat. You see in the pop-up there the number of different things that we're using for the computation. This one, actually, I wish we didn't name it points per person day. I absolutely hate that name now. I prefer amortized velocity. And the reason is because somebody brought up to me one day, they go, Tanner, you always try to tell us not to equate story points to time, but then you called it points per person day. And I'm like, oh, he's absolutely right. So I wish if I could take it back, I would have called it amortized velocity instead of points per person day. I found it's actually been a really useful metric, and I haven't seen other teams using this before to normalize for vacation days and for shorter sprint length. So it's actually been really useful for us so far. So the next one we'll talk about is quality, and this data is sourced entirely from Git. We scrape Git to figure out when teams are writing tests. So what this is showing you, and you see two colors, especially right over here, we are calculating the number of unit tests and integration tests written by team by sprint. This is the second metric we've used thus far for quality. This is better than our last one, but quality is a really hard thing to measure. So we're still finding our way through this. We don't know if this is where we're going to land yet. There might be another iteration later. But I can tell you that one of the useful stories happen when situations like this happen. There are sprints that occur where not writing tests is a possible outcome, and that's okay. But what's useful is when you see in the data that there were 0 tests written in a sprint, it makes for a good conversation for them to explain why they chose not to write tests that sprint. It's data that would be much harder to get at if not visualized in this form. I think one of the most useful metrics, one of the most talked about, the one that the teams love most is this one. We call it engagement. I'm sure many of you have taken surveys for products before where somebody asks you, would you recommend this product to a friend or colleague? This is the same thing. And what that's called is Net Promoter Score, NPS. This is the same thing, except we turn it internally. We ask the teams, would you recommend this team to a friend or colleague? And we ask them that every single sprint. And then they give us their score, and then it appears in the same NPS computation that you might have seen in the past. You actually see what we do is it's a survey in HipChat. So we created our own plugin in HipChat, and then they answer the survey. It takes seconds, and then it populates over into our database. And in this case, you see that the team was struggling here a little bit. They weren't really happy. There was a little strife in the team. There were some problems. And the organization listened to them. We heard about them. And the organization made some changes. And you see that it went up, and they were even happier than before. And as Ashley will tell you, she looked at it before we came here, and currently the NPS for that team is 100, which I hadn't seen before. And I'm not sure if I believe it. It is, well, we do a sprint over sprint. We've actually, we're curious now. I was talking to Daryl and Rocio about it tonight. Rocio is one of our Scrum Masters. Daryl's one of our product owners. We fear there might be some noise in the data, that it depends on how you feel that day when you complete the survey. We don't know what to do about that yet, but it is an interesting hypothesis. So the last two we'll look at is cycle time. For those not familiar with cycle time, what it really means is once you start working on something, you start a stopwatch. Once you finish doing that thing, you stop the stopwatch, and that's how many hours you spent. That's the cycle time for that particular issue. Jira has some great reports, I think, already that talk about cycle time, but we wanted to look at it on our dashboard, and we thought we would make some changes along the way to see if this might be useful for us. And what this is it's creating a single point of data per sprint. And the way it's doing that is it's looking at cycle time per story point and then plotting it on the graph. So we just started doing this recently. In fact, I'm going to talk about this a little more later, but this is a metric that was added at a team's request. We had a team who had decided to experiment with Kanban, and really probably what was Scrumban, and predictability didn't make sense for them. So they were like, can we add something to it? So we decided to add cycle time. I said, hey, sure, we can add it. Does one of your team members want to help us? And he took some time out to actually help craft this and populate the data for us. And this is, again, looking at just a single point of data per sprint and seeing that whether cycle time is increasing or decreasing. I will tell you as well, what was interesting is for that team that was experimenting with Scrumban, it turned out that their cycle time, in fact, went down. They started focusing on WIP limits. And as counterintuitive as they thought it was, it actually helped them get more done by opening fewer things, as I'm sure we all recognize in this room. What's nice is when you see data that helps emphasize that point, and it makes for a much more convincing argument. This is the last of the 6. So this is the last metric we'll talk about that we're using for our own initiative here. And this one's a little more complicated. So across the x-axis is the estimates for stories. So half a point stories, 1 point, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 8. And then across the y-axis is cycle time itself. So what we did here is we segmented out all the stories that were half points and 1 points and 2 and so on. And we wanted to get a feel for where those estimates were actually landing. So because we don't log time, we were using cycle time to see if teams were estimating well. What we wanted to see was a team that had twice as much cycle time roughly for a 1 point story than a half, and twice as much cycle time for a 2 point story than a 1, and approximately 5 times as much time for a 5 than a 1, and so on. And actually, it looked pretty good for this team. It's up and to the right. I might make an argument that the 3s and 5s are pretty close, but for me, it's good enough. And you know, the thing is, and I remind people of this often, if estimates were supposed to be accurate, they'd be called actuals. So this is good enough for me. This shows me that they are, in fact, trending in the right way. I would worry if I see that 5 point stories actually end up lower than 3 point stories. That's when I want to have a conversation. So here they all are again, all 6 of them. And I'm curious, since I threw a lot of information at you all at once, if you had any questions about these.
Can you explain cycle time, hours per point again?
Cycle time itself, you understand, I hope. So cycle time is the amount of, once you start working on something, how long did it take you to get that done? It's not worried about you logging time. It's only focused on this is the amount of time on a clock between you starting something and finishing something. As opposed to like logging hours, or as opposed to estimating something in story points or hours.
Doesn't matter when I start.
Right.
Doesn't matter when I end. Just how much time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Just to continue the same
Elapsed.
question, what is the correlation between, how do you see the lead time and cycle time?
Mhm.
I'm asking this because I'm also dealing with this. I'm at the moment that I'm making my decision about the framework I'm going to use. So I'm heavily thinking about using Kanban.
Yep.
So first of all, what is the correlation between lead time and cycle time? Plus, if it would have any sort of impact on a product backlog if you just put that on.
Well, the first one's easy for me to answer. I don't know because we don't look at lead time right now. No, and in fact, it would be hard to because a lot of things end up in our backlog and then we never end up actioning it. And other stuff instantly end up there, even though it was somebody's idea for a long time. They just now created a backlog item. So it's hard for us to analyze cycle time because of how we do business today. Yeah. Thank you.
Common this team to someone else or something like that. I just thought as a subjective metric that you probably use, or is it any other subjective metric that you?
Oh, you're talking about the engagement piece. You're talking about
I'm talking about
this right here.
Yeah, is it the only?
It is the only subjective piece that we measure. Everything else is coming from data from Jira and Git and Namely. There's no argument about when people are taking PTO days or what velocity for teams are. Yeah, or what cycle time is for that matter. Yeah. Any other questions?
Actually, on this one, you said you had some issues with catching people on a bad day.
Mm-hmm.
And it occurs to me that I don't know HipChat, but if once in a while, maybe once per sprint, if it just popped, if HipChat decided to ask each person at a random time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Could you answer our survey right now?
We could.
You
That's
get 2 values from that person.
Yeah.
And then at different times,
Yeah.
it would probably give you a different way of looking at that question of bad days.
That's a good idea. That's not one that we've explored yet, but yeah, I mean, with the hypothesis we're working from now, that might be a way to help mitigate some of the noise in the data. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I love this, by the way, and particularly around the cycle time stuff, we focus a lot in that area too, and almost exactly the way you think of it here.
My question to you on cycle time is, you see it, the cycle time clock stops when it's done.
Yeah.
What represent me because done means I moved the story to complete. Done means I released the software. Done means I got the first customer feedback on it. You know.
So you weren't supposed to ask me that question.
So people didn't ask me that question.
For us, I cheated a little bit, and I'll tell you why. It goes back to what I said about a good metric under the team's influence. And I cheated a little bit by saying, once you get it to in acceptance, once you have done all the work as a team and the product owner now needs to accept the work, we'll stop the clock on you. So we cheated a little bit with our cycle time. Although I think if I had added in the extra time to get it done, it wouldn't be a lot. But the conversations with the team, they would use that as a basis to say the data isn't correct or isn't proper. So I was using, because it's close enough for me and because it would alleviate that argument, we chose to end the cycle or end the clock at in acceptance. Yes, ma'am?
Yeah, one of the goals that you had in one of your earlier slides.
Sure.
Craft framework for team experimentation.
We're going to talk about that next.
Okay, I'm getting a little ahead.
In fact, that is a great segue. I appreciate that. That was perfect. I owe you money. Look at that. Next slide. So how does this help us experiment? Yes. Oh, Dan, go ahead. This one? Great question. So it starts when a story moves to in progress, which automatically occurs in our system once somebody starts working on the first task for a story. We do take out weekends for the cycle time calculation, but we use a 24-hour clock for weekdays. Does that answer your question? Was I right, Ashley? Did we change it? Did you change it? You talked to Nick, didn't you? We'll talk later. I'll talk about how we use this to experiment, and this is very applicable to our Scrum Masters who we had rolled this out with and with our teams. So again, I want to remind you that we wanted to use this as a basis for experimentation. We wanted a framework to operate within. And the way we did this, and you know what, I like how Deming puts it. He says, change is not necessary, survival is not mandatory. He'd also probably roll in his grave right now when I took his plan, do, check, act loop and flattened it to plan, do, check, done. But I'll explain why I flattened it in a moment. So what we do is the teams get together and they're in the planning phase, and we're tracking all this stuff in Jira. And they're in plan, and they brainstorm and experiment. And we're not talking everything that a team does has to be an experiment. We're talking about bigger swings, like we want to try some more aggressive WIP limits. We want to try out Kanban instead of Scrum. We want to try out yesterday's weather because Jeff Sutherland said it was amazing. Things like that. Those are bigger swings, not things like, well, I'm going to do some cross-training and work on my development skills or something like that. That's not something we would do an experiment for. So teams still have the freedom to tweak their process as they see fit, and they use this framework for some bigger swings, because usually these experiments are taking about 5 to 7, 8 sprints. So these are longer experiments that we run. And what the team does is they get together and they brainstorm ideas, and then they figure out which one they want to experiment with. They then try to figure out a hypothesis, similar to how we create hypothesis for the tests that we put out in production. I think this is going to be a 10% improvement to speed, or I think it's going to have a cost at this particular measure. Or maybe there's a metric that they're tracking that isn't part of our Agile metrics, and that's fine too. They can use that as a basis for a hypothesis. They then communicate that up, so me and my manager, Jim, who's here tonight, we vet a lot of the experiments, and we're not doing it to tell them you can't do this. We do it to try to poke holes in what the team has come up with and give them other ideas that might make the experiment better before they start conducting it, and maybe give them some additional things to measure. So once they go through that process, they go to do, where it's simply collecting the data and getting together as a team to see what that data is telling you. And then maybe you decide as a team that this was a terrible idea and you pull the plug and you move on to something else. Or maybe you decide this is great and we really like what's going on, and you start telling other teams what you've been up to. And then the next phase of this, and again, this is about 6 sprints later, we do a check where they now have either proven or disproven their hypothesis. And whether they prove it to be true or not, maybe they still choose to adopt it as a team agreement, or maybe they choose to tweak it because it wasn't quite right, or maybe, again, they kill it because it didn't work for the team. And in this case, what's useful about this framework is that not only are you basing how you feel about something different in an emotion, you're also basing it in some amount of data. And I admit it's very unscientific. There is no statistical significance with this. There's just not enough data to do so. But the data is useful because it informs conversations that the team is having as they're doing these experiments. And then finally, it rolls to done. And again, I'm tracking it in Jira, which is why I flattened it out. And then they begin again finding a new experiment to brainstorm with. But they log some data about details about the experiment so that others who might want to do it later might pull from that and use that as a resource. So I hope that answers your question.
I was going to ask further examples, but
Okay, good. So we've learned a lot. I think the thing that we have learned that has been most useful, and actually I was pleasantly surprised by, was the fact that it took us only a 24-hour hackathon to put this together and make it live, and teams started using it on the other side. It was that easy, and I did not expect to be able to put it together this quickly. It turned out great. I don't know if Mike and Salil are just rock stars, and of course you are. But it really got launched quickly. So if you're looking to do something like this, it might not be nearly as daunting as you might think. Also, leadership support isn't enough. And let me explain what I mean. It's not enough that leaders backed what we were doing. We also needed them to understand that if you see data that concerns you, do not get involved and start trying to fix something. Just keep your distance. We will find you when we need you. Ask us tough questions. Ask us what we think something means. Don't make judgments in the data, and don't try to fix something. Allow the teams the autonomy to do so, and they have, and it's been great. I like this, actually. I titled a blog with this blog post with the same title not long ago. The map is not the territory. It's not enough that you're looking at data. If you're just looking at a map and not looking at the terrain around you, you're not learning much. Data is just the start of a conversation. And that's the thing that a few people reminded me of tonight, is that the emphasis around this data isn't the data. The emphasis is the conversations it's meant to inspire. And that's the part that matters most. So you can't just look at a map to understand your terrain. You need to look up. You need to look at the people. You need to have questions for them, because data doesn't really answer any questions. It just leads you to ask better questions. With data, of course, comes baggage. I'm sure many of us have worked in organizations where data has been used as a weapon against us, and it is a very uncomfortable place to be. And that's, again, goes back to the right leadership support. And it also goes towards one of our biggest challenges, is getting the team members to engage with this, to be interested in what the data says, that it's not just the Scrum Master putting it in front of the team, requiring them to look at it for the next 15 minutes, that they actually want to look at it. And that's been one of the hardest challenges. The way that I found my way through that was a little sneaky. I started finding people to help make our metrics better. And they would improve it. They would iterate it. They would fix some things. They would add a new metric. They would explore ideas. And then they would be proud of the thing that they just did. And they would show it off to their teams. And that's been one way that's really been helpful to get ground root support with this. And in fact, Ashley, I don't know if you knew I took that picture. So actually, it's been a few days analyzing all the data that we had, about a year's worth of data, and I asked her and another one of our data analysts, Ala, who got together to do this, to just try to find interesting questions to answer, like is there a correlation between our amortized velocity and our engagement? Is it in fact a leading indicator for us or not? And her and Ala went through and they looked at all this stuff, they sifted through the data, answered some tough questions, and then afterwards Ashley went back to her desk and she started showing her team, which is the same team of which we've been looking at data this whole night. She went back to the team, and this is all of them. There's Mark and Ashley and Shannon and Brandon and Pierre, a QE, 2 devs, a data analyst, and a designer. These are cross-functional teams we're working with here. And they just started having a conversation about it. I didn't inspire it. I didn't make them do it. I just sat in the back with a smile and a camera and took that picture. It was great. It was a great thing to see, and it's those kinds of conversations I had been hoping to inspire. Now, here's the tough part. About a year, maybe 6 months ago, 6 months to a year ago, I was looking at the data at the aggregate. So I was looking at data across all the teams, across the organization. And I looked at it, and it wasn't particularly compelling. It wasn't particularly interesting. and I couldn't figure out why. And this whole time I've been talking, I'm curious from all of you, if you could expedite this and not take 6 months to answer this question, if you could tell me what it was that I had been overlooking this entire time.
Perhaps you were looking at the map and not the territory.
Astute, yes, but can you be more specific?
Well, the territory is the people, the teams, the people who are on those teams.
You're close, but not quite. Anybody? Dan? Also very close to what I had in mind, and that is absolutely true. I've actually put aside the conversation of deploying more often because we keep on just naturally getting better at it. We keep on getting closer and closer to continuous delivery. Anybody else have any guesses? That you're right there. So here's the saying I've been preaching to all my teams that outcomes over outputs. And this whole time, a year working on this project, and this whole time I'm measuring outputs. And I didn't even know I was doing it. It was embarrassing. I couldn't believe that I'd spent all this time measuring all these outputs because who cares that I've doubled velocity? Who cares that my teams are incredibly happy? Well, I do. But is it really impacting the customers? Are the customers happier? Are we making more money? And so I think the next chapter of this story is a simple one. How are we going to tie outcomes, the things that we're doing for our customers, back to what the outputs, the things that the teams are doing every day? How do I tie what Ashley is doing at her desk with her analysis of all our tests and all the other data analysis that she does to how we're impacting the customers? And it's that outcomes over outputs that is, I think, again, the next chapter of the story.
What kind of customer sat data do you have available at the moment, and what's the gap between what you have and what you need?
We just recently, where's Rachel? Oh, she had to leave early. That's too bad. Rachel was one of our product owners, and she was the first to finally release our first NPS survey to our customers. So we don't have any data yet, but we will soon.
NPS alone may not answer the questions you need answered.
That's true.
Well, I mean, if revenue is one of the main things to look at, because how revenue is coming in based on the test that we built.
The good news is we do have a lot of outcome data because of all the tests that we run, and that's what I had mentioned at the beginning. There's a lot of data out there. I think the hard part for us right now is how do we dissect it by team? It's easy to look at organizationally, but how do we know what teams are responsible for what? And also, how do we get more data, more qualitative data about the customer and not all this quantitative data? I think that's one of the things that the organization is wrestling with now is we do a great job of collecting quantitative data. The qualitative stuff, not as much yet, and we're working on that. We're spending a lot more time talking to our customers instead of just using data as a proxy for the customers. So I'll leave you with this, and again, this will be another surprise for Ashley. So this was given to me quite a while ago from Katya, one of our designers, who was talking to another one of our designers, Paul, who was talking to Ashley. And I'm viewing this data that we've been collecting in the same kind of way of this conversation here. And the way I consider estimates is for estimates don't matter. It's the conversation that gets you towards the estimate that matters. And the same thing here, what matters is the conversation. The conversation helps you understand how people are thinking. And understanding how people are thinking is more valuable than just arguing somebody's point. And so these are the kinds of conversations I hope if you bring this back to your own organization, you can inspire from your team members as well. So with that, do I have any more questions? Yes, ma'am.
Do you do anything specific or avoid anything to, in terms of teams setting up competition?
No. We only compare teams to themselves at different points in time. We have purposely avoided trying to compare teams to other teams.
So the data from a team is their own property or their own?
It is, but because in the spirit of transparency, you can view other teams' data, but we would never suggest and never encourage and would discourage people from comparing one team to another.
So I had an earlier conversation this evening, and we were talking about making teams truly cross-functional to maximize output.
Mm-hmm.
So now teams become truly cross-functional, then isn't this whole concept null and void now?
Why do you say that?
Because if teams are, got team A, B, and C, whatever, they may each have their own domains.
Mhm.
But now, team C is the one who has the most value added for this run in moving team A and B into something that, well, okay, we'll do our best, but it's not our domain, but, we'll help you, and you may get 30, 40% more output than you would have otherwise. But now it's like,
Well, again,
you see where I'm going?
where we don't compare teams to other teams. That's number one. And number two, and actually I've been meaning to write about this for a while, is I found that one of the words I hate most is efficiency. I absolutely despise that word. And I despise it because people use that word to defend why they want to work in their silo and not become cross-functional. I don't care about efficiency, I care about effectiveness. And those are two very different things. So even if you were to make cross-functional teams like the teams that we have today, that is not enough. I continue to break down those barriers. Even when we show the value of working cross-functionally, it is a continuous conversation to convince people that it works, which is interesting to me. I didn't expect that. We have very mature teams here who do great things, and it's great to be part of an organization where you don't have to convince people that Scrum works. You instead are trying to have conversations about what you do next because there's no literature on where we are now. So we have to often blaze our own trail. So I guess I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I will tell you that when you have cross-functional teams, you've just started. I said you just started. When you get cross-functional teams, that's the beginning. There's a lot more to do. Yes, sir.
I'm really glad you arrived at it's about the customer and actually the impact there. I'm wondering, do you do anything in terms of estimation of that benefit? So we look at
You mean like business value?
business value estimate, right? We have effort estimate, we have business value estimate, and there's this prioritization conversation. Your thoughts on
We don't. I think it's been explored in the past before I came on board, and I don't think it worked out as well as they had hoped. Now we are doing a few different experiments at the organizational level, like right now. We're experimenting with large-scale Scrum. We're seeing how that works with a few teams. We're trying this thing called a goal-setting pilot, to where we're involving teams to a much greater degree in setting goals based on the leadership's vision from above, from various objectives. And I think that's sort of going towards some of that. But it's not something that we've tried to measure yet. I actually see, we just did some goal setting stuff today, and I see the teams are struggling with this idea of setting their own goals. We look at a lot of data, but when you put in front of them, hey, we want you to decide your own fate, they get a little quiet and awkward, not because they don't want to say anything, they just don't know what to say.
You had mentioned about half the teams are technical.
Yes.
I'm curious what the other teams are doing, and if they're also fully part of this process.
Great question. So there's two sides of the building here. There's this building over here, and then there's one next door at 100 View. So this side is our content teams. These are the teams who are working with our contractors to build out the crap ton of content we have on our site. You have on the other side, those are the non-technical teams I speak of. The technical teams are the ones who are building the new features next door, or the ones who are building out our infrastructure and helping with our pipeline, which helps us with continuous delivery. Those are the technical teams next door. They use Scrum, which are 6 teams, and these 6 non-technical teams over here use Scrum as well. That answers one part of your question, I think. The other part is, the answer is no. I've been focused on the folks upstairs. I haven't got any allies down in content yet, although raise your hand if you're on a content team. Daisy, thank you for recording tonight. I really appreciate it. And Lena, anybody else? Oh, and Matt. I don't know how much they've been exposed to it. I've been relying on the Scrum Masters down here, and I've been so focused on what's going on upstairs that I haven't promoted it nearly enough for the teams down here. So it's just us upstairs. Them? Yeah. Well, with Les, it's funny. With Les, we have one team down here and one team upstairs that are part of our Les experiment. And I think some of the metrics that we've been doing, I think there's been some traction on potentially using them downstairs now because of that Les adoption.
Follow-on question: are there other parts of the company that are not adopting Scrum and Agile? Because we talk about Walmart.com, we talk about the finance team.
Yeah. Well, IT, there's only 2 people in IT right now. They don't use Scrum. They just do their own thing. And there are a few pockets that aren't using it, but they also have to learn how to interact well with all the Scrum teams that we do have. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
How does third-party dependencies fit into Scrum?
You know the answer to that.
I see some conflict, so I want to engage.
Third party. All right, fine. I'll answer it. You know, I shouldn't have study.com people ask questions. So we actually had one of our product owners dress up as me for Halloween. And then he took the mic after he won. He was like standing on trash cans because it's a short joke, because short jokes are funny around here. He was like, had trash cans to show he was short, and he took the mic and he said something that I usually say. I often tell people that my job is to actively do nothing. My job is to put myself out of one. And he said that. It was funny that at a funny moment at our Halloween party, here he is preaching the things I've been trying to teach. But that's unrelated to your question, though. So how does Scrum deal with third-party stuff? I usually suggest that as much as you can get away with, only focus your Scrum teams around what you can control as much as possible. I mean, sometimes you just can't get around it, but the more you have external entities as part of your process, the more you're going to run into issues. So the best way to mitigate that, in my opinion, usually, but not always, is to make them separate, is that your story and your work ends when your responsibility ends to doing something. Any other questions? Yes, sir. All our teams are, well, yeah, thank you for that. So we have the 6 teams I work with upstairs, all use Scrum save one, and that one uses Scrumban. And that one found Scrumban through experimenting with it to find its way towards something that works for them. It's the first time, actually, I've seen any of our teams venture away from Scrum, which I think is great. It's nice to see when a Scrum shop starts becoming an Agile shop. Because I've written, actually this is where I got attention from Jeff Sutherland and Mike Beadle when I had written about how I think Scrum is not Agile. They didn't like that.
Well,
So,
I absolutely agree with you.
Thank you.
I didn't read your article or blog, but someone told me once that you learn how to play chess, and you move the pieces in a certain way to play chess, and if you don't move them that way, you may have a fun game, but you're not playing chess.
Right.
And they related that to Scrum. And then and my almost immediate response was, well then, what about continuous improvement?
Mm-hmm.
Can you not also continuously improve what you at this particular moment in time call Scrum?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, the thing is I identify as a Scrum Master. My business card says as much. So, I mean, I say this a bit of tongue-in-cheek, but my point is that Scrum is the start, it's not the end. Agile is a mindset, and Scrum is a mechanic. Agile is about people over everything. It's about accepting uncertainty. Scrum is a set of ceremonies that you follow in order to hopefully reinforce an Agile mindset, but just because you do Scrum doesn't inherently mean you're going to be Agile. And in fact, one of the questions that I asked when we had a Scrum Master position open to all the candidates was, is Scrum Agile? And I always paid attention when somebody said no, but it rarely happened. I shouldn't tell you all that in case we open another Scrum Master position, but now you know.
You already know my answer.
Yeah. Any other questions? You know, we have the aggregate. We have a dashboard for it. I didn't even include it as a screenshot here because after I came to this conclusion that we were looking at outputs, it wasn't so interesting to me, and we haven't been using it as much as an organization, and nobody asks me questions about it. We've really been focused on the team and not the aggregate. And when we did aggregate, again, that question earlier about comparing teams, we didn't compare teams. We were summing up values, not averaging values. Yes, ma'am.
So your teams, I'm assuming they're consistent.
We keep them together as long as we can get away with. Okay. Not nearly long enough, in my opinion, but as long as we can get away with.
So then I guess an interesting metric would be to see if, depending on the teams, the members that went to another team, did the scalability change? Did you get more output?
Well, Ashley, didn't you try to answer that question when you did that analysis a few weeks back? I was surprised. I actually expected a bigger impact. It didn't show in the data. It doesn't mean it wasn't there, but it didn't show in our data as far as we could tell. Well, yeah, a lot of the teams, there used to be a time before I came on board where we would change up these teams almost quarterly. And so most of these people, because we retain our employees for a long time, a lot of these people knew each other well. So this wasn't the first time they'd worked with another person when they changed.
So do you think that the outcome would be different if all of a sudden you got a surge of 100 people never worked?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, we're sort of faced that right now with one of our teams where we combined a new discipline into a team, and this new discipline had never worked with a real Scrum team before, and there's a struggle, and it's showing. Uh-huh. The point, again, is the conversation. The point is that you're looking at data and comparing yourself at various points in time. And by yourself, I mean the team. And that's one piece, is the conversation. And about at least once a sprint, the team will bring up this data and we'll just talk about it. What does it mean? What happened? What does this mean? Why did it spike here and why did it go down here? And sometimes those conversations lead to action. Other times it's just an interesting conversation. Sometimes it's not interesting at all. And the other part we use it for is the experimentation that I spoke of, where the teams are experimenting with bigger kinds of things that the organization might be suspicious about that won't work, but they support because they're curious. They're just as curious about the data. Say again? I broke it several times until it started working right, and then I was happy. I started using Jira. It was not that long ago. I started using Jira when I was working at a gaming company out in Reno, Nevada. I've only been using it for something like 4 years now, and they made me an admin. I never used it before, and then they gave me 2 weeks to get used to it. I used to be a software engineer, so I've written a lot of code in the background to do some stuff, and now I have fun with workflows. I don't write as much code as I used to. But it's just a matter of messing up any number of times to figure out what things do. Jira's pretty easy to get used to. The admin module is pretty beefy, but if you can find the pattern amongst the admin module, it'll start to make sense to you. I can't believe I'm promoting Jira right now for you guys. Yes, sir.
What kind of tool are you using for your dashboard?
This is Tableau. Anything else back there, Ashley? Just Tableau? Okay. So all the code that we had written, we used Jira's REST API and written, I think it was, I'm guessing it was Java, and that helped us push the data. I think all the code we've been written has been in Java, and then we push it to the database, and then from there, Tableau takes care of the rest of the work to visualize what you see. Hola. You know what? I will tell you something, and I have never seen anything like this before. I have never worked in an organization where these teams are actually using the tool and updating it frequently. When I came here, I was surprised at how well they updated it. It is uncommon to see something not in the right status. And it's not because I'm nagging them. They're just doing it on their own because it's just part of their daily life. What do you mean by? Well, I always tell our teams that if you're spending more than 5 minutes a day in Jira, you're doing something wrong. So if you're spending more than 5 minutes, that means I need to spend some time with you to teach you something you don't know, or I need to fix something in Jira because it's not as optimal as it should be. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. I mean, they see it every day at the stand-up, and if something's not in the right status, one of us are going to ask, isn't that supposed to be done? So because we have stand-ups daily and because we're looking at our board when we do, it's not uncommon to have a few things that are out of place. It's actually, maybe with my teams, you see it happen like once a week at most. There is about 100 people. Jim, over 100, or we're at about 100, 105? Okay. Yeah.
So earlier you mentioned that you're releasing 6 times roughly up to maybe
6 times a day across our 6-feature team, or technical team.
I think that, it could be the analogy of playing the wrong note on the piano, but the question is regression errors.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's an error after third release that day. The idea being that the feedback
Back there is going to be fixed in the fourth or fifth.
release that day, but how's the whole QA thing, adequate QA, fit into 6 releases per day? I guess
So,
that's my question.
we have wall boards all over upstairs that tell us the state of our site. And there is just from XP whole code ownership. If somebody sees something go red, somebody's going to jump on it quick, regardless of if you just deployed or not. So because of that and because of how we release, and Jim would explain it much better than I, but when we release to one node at a time and we give it a little bit of traffic to see if it's going well. And if it's going well, we release it to another node and start putting more traffic to it. So we have a lot of mechanisms in place to ensure that if something's going to go wrong, we're going to know it quick.
Okay, so it's not a release to everything,
Yeah.
it's a rollout.
And that's part of our pipeline.
It's a rollout, and that's how you catch those and
Yeah.
fix them before they make it.
But every now and then something does go out, and that's when our teams will jump and see something on that wall board, and somebody will jump and start fixing it.
How do you measure all that data? I mean, it's not part of these metrics. But you
Yes.
get from them.
We have a report that gets sent out nightly about how many deploys were done in the day and who did it and when it happened.
And do you then, are you able to take that data and correlate it back
Mm.
to your test created for sprint?
We haven't yet. That's an interesting idea. That's not something we've thought to do yet.
'Cause I was looking at that for the longest time. I'm like, okay, great. You know, either there was a lot of stuff that maybe needed to be, or we wanted to write it, or we were working so hard on some of the other stuff we didn't get as many done,
Yeah.
but we got enough
Yeah.
done, and we'll make up later, or da, 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 da.
Well, there used to be a time when we would avoid like the plague of Friday deploy because somebody's going to be on call. It's funny now that that's no longer a thing. We're now comfortable with deploying on Fridays because we're comfortable with the state or with our bar of quality. And we have quality engineers on many of our teams who aren't just quality engineers, who are also developers and who also cross-train and figure out skills from other people and help out when needed. So although we have people with a quality background, again, we embrace being cross-functional teams, and they cross-train a lot with each other.
But now, I apologize because that's my third question, so I have to shut up now. But how long? Because you said we weren't that comfortable.
Huh.
What was your maturation process for this lack of feature of Friday?
God, I've been here for 2.5 years now, so I would say there used to be a time when we had an actual baton, a little stupid toy that would sit on somebody's desk, and that said, I'm deploying right now, and you were the only person who could deploy. Since then, we've created an automated pipeline through HipChat that you're able to deploy without that baton. There's still only one deploy, but they're faster and faster. When I first got here, I would say deploys took 2.5 hours. I'm waiting to see if he's going to tell me I'm wrong. June 2015. Okay, 2.5 hours, and I want to say, and we actually have the product owner here for the team who works on the pipeline right over there. I want to say deploys are usually about an hour now. Edwin, am I right? Yeah. Okay, so about an hour. So it continues to get better and better, and because we've had QEs help harden a lot of the integration tests that we have when things are going out the door, we've been more and more comfortable. So I would say that it's changed from Friday deploys over the last 1.5 years to where it's gradually come to a place where they're like, whatever, it's another deploy regardless of the day. Are you getting any more questions? You're all done.
How long are your sprints and does that?
2-week sprints.
And every team starts and stops the sprint
Yes.
at the same time? And so people are deploying any time during the sprint.
Correct.
So you don't, a deploy wouldn't happen until a certain something got done.
Right.
So done isn't related to the end of the sprint.
No, it's not. Our definition of done, the biggest part of which is deployed to production. So in order for somebody to call something done, it must be out the door and in the customer's hands. Oftentimes it might be behind a feature flag, but it is in production.
So is that story by story then?
Yes. Well, I will tell you that one of the ones here where you see predictability up in the top left, right there, just shows a little bug because predictability to them is pointless. You can't compare the beginning and end of a sprint because there is no such thing as that sprint. Now, they still have the same kind of cadence. They still do sprint reviews at the same cadence as the rest of the organization. They just happen to not do a lot of planning. They plan just enough to get started, and then they bring more work in as appropriate. So they look at everything except this one. Ask that question one more time. I think so. I might be a little biased, but I think so. I think what it's helped most isn't so much the efficiency versus effectiveness. I think what it's helped is to better emphasize a culture of experimentation. And that, I think, is valuable because in order to continuously learn, you must embrace the fact that you're not going to know whether something is going to work or not. You just have to try it and then see if it works for you. And having not only the emotional response to it, but some kind of data behind it is a useful supplement. All right, one more question, if there's any left, or did we get them all? I think we got them all. Thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate it. Oh, it's fantastic. So,